So just to kind of kick things off, there's a lot going on in healthcare. Coming off of a pretty crazy years, things are still pretty hectic. Why is it really critical at this point in time to be thinking and talking about brand?
Yeah, when we think about rebranding, our minds, immediately go to or jump to the look and feel of the brand. When organizations start to embark on this journey, there's very much a traditional first mindset approach to building out that visual identity as it stems from the rebrand, especially in healthcare. When we look at traditionally, the patient experience has primarily been offline. So because of that, when we embark on these rebranding journeys, we think about updating our logo, our colors, and we package those in a way that makes sense for print or offline assets. The static, the non-flexible pieces of brand collateral. And that's just really one side of the coin, right? So when we think about the other side of that coin, it's oftentimes completely neglected or an afterthought altogether, and that's very much the digital experience. Right, so when we think about the world we live in such a fragmented space, which reinforces the need for a comprehensive brand style guide to ensure a very continuous, a very consistent brand experience, one that crosses into the chasm of digital, where the brand experience becomes seamless and singular, regardless of the touch point. So when we think about, the main reasons for needing a comprehensive style guide, one that's inclusive of the traditional in addition to the digital, is the customer experience is fragmented, meaning there are a number of different touch points, access points the consumer has with your brand that's essential to provide that continuity across the entire patient journey. So whether it's offline, in person, mobile, web, email, social media, in today's world, the customer experience starts and ends with digital. So there's no question we live in a digital world. It's become the front door. So in growing fashion, thanks to the supercharged transformation brought on by the pandemic, the entire experience can and absolutely will be on digital across the various, across or within specific customer segments. So when we think about, one, the customer experience is fragmented. Because of that, so are the teams that bring those experiences to life. So meaning there are different people, groups, departments that work on your brand to help shape that brand perception and experience, whether it's an in-house creative team, marketing team, other operational teams, freelancers, agency partners. It's essential to have that kind of brand consistency, that comprehensive brand style guide to drive the governance and reinforcement. By having that centralized governance at the core, stemming from the style guide, the surface of the brand experience to the consumer doesn't feel fragmented, but rather a seamless experience, one experience. So, and that's really the goal, right? It's about the consistency. It's about the flexibility to provide that continuity across the various touch points. So brand consistency builds trust, which establishes the loyalty. So the consistency and the continuity removes the friction.
Yeah, I think that's, we're at a point with healthcare where we've been moving so fast, and a lot of organizations have been launching a lot of different initiatives. And that point you're making about the consistency and the importance of that, I think is, we always strive for that, but it's a challenge to keep up with the speed that we're moving at these days. So I think it is an important thing to step back and take a look and maybe think about that. And to kind of do that and dig in a little deeper, we've got quite a range of folks in the audience today, people with different roles and experiences in relation to brand. And so I always think it's good to kind of pause and take a moment to think about what is brand. When I see some of the lists and things that go into what a brand is, there's always something on there where I'm thinking, I've got my eye. I had my eye so firmly over here, I forgot about that piece. So take us through just, thinking about brand.
Yeah, I think, simply put, your brand is defined by the perception of your customers of you, right? So it's that simple, but that hard, right? So your brand isn't what you say it is. It's what your customers say it is. It's how your brand makes them feel. So let's decode that a little bit. the ultimate goal, for most people on this call, or especially those that are marketers, is to get customers to understand and believe in and evangelize the brand essence. So the more consumers can grasp that brand essence and are willing and eager to share it with others, the stronger that relationship, and the less likely they are to churn and switch to a competitor. So establishing that brand's essence in the mind of the consumer is really ultimately the promised land of a marketer, and oftentimes, it's really hard to achieve. So if your brand is defined by the perceptions of your customer, your job is to help shape that. So the best way to illustrate this, and I love this illustration, is to really understand the full capacity and the full depths of the brand. And I like this illustration of the iceberg pyramid, right? So when we look at the iceberg pyramid, the bulk of the brand is actually the unseen brand, right? The brand strategy or the perceived brand. But once you start to kind of get out of the water, at the water surface, that's where the visible brand starts to take shape. That's where the thing that is below the surface starts to shape into the visual language of what that brand is. So it's really the seen and unseen of the brand. So when we start underwater, at the very bottom, it's the things that your brand must reflect throughout every brand element and touch point, and those are your core values, right? So when we move from core values, we go to the brand promise, right? So why do you exist beyond making money? This is also known as, what is your mission? What's your reason for being? From your brand purpose, what's your promise, right? So what's the value or experience your customers can expect every single time they interact with you, regardless of what the touch point is throughout the patient journey? What can they expect of your brand? And that's your promise. And it's what the thing that you are really selling beyond just the tangible transactional pieces. As we move from brand promise, what's the positioning? How do you differentiate within a sea of sameness? What makes you different compared to your competitors? And then we move into market strategy. What are the methods? What are the marketing tactics and channels and media used to market and amplify that brand essence? What's the niche target audiences? Who are you trying to reach? How will your customers engage with the brand? And then we start to move into the brand personality or the voice, the core messaging. And this is the part that kind of bobs up and down. It starts below the surface because it's important to have that DNA thread, but it also starts to get past the water surface because it can start to feel tangible. So it starts to visibly blend with a deeper brand below the surface. It's the attitudes, it's the methods of communication. So now we're completely out of the water, and we're at the surface level, and this is where the offering or the user experience really comes into play. And oftentimes, this is the thing that gets overlooked. Ensuring that the way we design and deliver product or service experiences is embedding how the deeper brand experience should feel. So none of this should be done in a silo. Using the lower half of this iceberg to feed into the offering or the UX is really essential, but it's oftentimes overlooked, especially when we in marketing or in brand communications or communications are communicating a certain message about the experience, but the actual experience isn't paying that off. That message has to pay off the actual experience. Otherwise, you'll start to have the brand trust or brand equity starts to erode over time. So it's important that they're feeding one another. And then we move into the visual identity. So the colors, the topography, the imagery, the textures, the brand graphics, etc. The bulk of what the visible brand becomes. And again, these are the things that translate your brand essence or the bottom half into a visual language. And at the tip of this is of course the logo, the actual icon or the word mark that makes up the core visual representation of the brand. So I really like this representation because it sheds light on the weight that the bottom or the hidden half of the brand has in driving the visual identity and bringing that brand strategy to life. It's often easy to overlook, as as the stuff we can't see and head straight into, the logo and then down to the visual identity. Again, a consistent brand experience helps increase the overall value your company by reinforcing your position in the marketplace. And with that consistency and continuity, it proves over and over again by keeping your brand promise. So it's absolutely crucial and essential to think about the brand from the beginning as you head into the rebrand.
Yeah, I agree that it's a great visual that really shows, like you said, the weight of those things under the water. I think we've all experienced projects where we were trying to shift the things above the water without making the deeper changes, and really struggling against that that effort of trying to just through a change to a mark or to the visuals convey something that wasn't very well defined, or wasn't fully supported.
Yeah, but better understanding the bottom half of this somewhat points you in a direction. It somewhat establishes a North Star where it makes the top half easier to get to, or it provides a little bit more of a guardrail framework in making those decisions because it makes sense, it's aligned, and there's continuity.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I think in healthcare is it's pretty rare that we're starting into a project to create a brand from scratch. Organizations we work with and have histories going back, sometimes almost hundreds of years, and things change a lot over that time. And they're certainly not the same kind of organization they were 150 years ago, but there's a legacy there that you're working with, and legacy in the communities and those connections. But as things are changing over time, I think the question kind of comes up: why do you rebrand? When do you know that that's the right time to change how you're presenting yourself? How would somebody know that it's time to shake things up?
Yeah. Well, first, I find that, and I love that you use the word legacy. I love thinking about that in terms of an organization that's been around a long time, because there's tremendous value in that legacy, that credibility. There's already brand equity, and just a matter of an evolution over time. So let's walk through 5 of the more common reasons why healthcare organizations rebrand. The first one is a good reason to rebrand is when you need to better differentiate yourself from the competition. In any kind of rebrand, it's important to conduct a competitive analysis, right? Put all your competitors on one screen, and do you look and feel differently? Especially in a highly commoditized space, being like everyone else creates further commoditization, and it creates challenges in building loyalty over time and building that brand recognition. Especially depending on what your market share is, or where you are within that market. If you're not the number one player, and you might be the 2, 3, 4, not having that visual differentiation, it can lead to brand misattribution, meaning the marketing you're doing, the communications you're doing, the advertising you're doing, because it looks and feels and sounds similar, they might attribute that to that of one of the more number one brand in that space, or that region. And what in fact you might actually be doing is driving traffic to your competition. So it's just good to kind of do a pulse check, and just see where you sit within what could be a sea of sameness. Another reason is sometimes organizations are in a position where they're looking to attract a new group of people, but your current branding and visual ID is not primed to help you connect to that group. So your brand should always speak to the people you're trying to reach, right? Another reason is thinking about the iceberg. If you have evolved your brand strategy, or a culmination of the thing of the things that are underwater, it's important that your brand identity reflects that. So as you change the bottom half of the iceberg, ask yourself, does the top half need to evolve as well to best convey or best translate that to the visual identity that best conveys the brand essence? The fourth one, you've merged or acquired. This type of rebrand should be done with care and with long-term vision in mind. determining what the brand architecture should be when the two brands work nicely with one another and can, come together naturally. Especially when you're at an organization where, M&A activity might be part of the growth plan. So having that in mind, if it's one or if it's many over the course of years, having that in mind can help structure the rebrand. So as we think about the brand architecture, there's a spectrum for how we can organize our brands or our products, or our services within the system organization. So the first one is the branded house. This is where different products and services are organized around a corporate umbrella. So think products and services serving the same market. In this example for FedEx, you'll notice the product or service becomes a descriptor beneath the umbrella brand. So the umbrella brand is still center stage with emphasis. The umbrella brand, the FedEx brand, is the dominant brand in this use case. The other option is moving to a sub-brand architecture. So this is when brands are able to augment and connect to the master brand. So different brands that enter different markets but are still able to connect around the master's positioning and promise. So in this example, Virgin, much like the branded house, but they are more than just a different set of products or services. They are a brand. So you can see that the sub-brand takes position after the master brand with emphasis. The third option or way to organize is endorsed brand. So this is where you might have brands or products and services that are endorsed by larger brands. So this provides those brands with a separate identity, but is still able to fit within the larger brand. So having the larger brand serve as that endorser also gives credibility to the endorsed brand, tapping into the endorser brand's existing consumer affinity, existing brand equity. So it actually means something. There's that connection there. So in the Marriott example, you have your main larger brand with several different brands that are endorsed by the larger brand, Marriott. The last example is a house of brands, and this is when a company oversees a set of standalone brands. So take, for example, P&G. They have a number of different brands under the master brand. Each brand extension is separate from one another and from the master brand. So they're not associated with one another. So they keep them separate within their each individual verticals. But with that comes complexities, right? It becomes hard to manage. When you have separate brands acting as their own, that means separate brand strategies. That means separate go-to-market plans, marketing strategies, budgets, teams. The advantage here with the house of brands is the separation can de-risk the brand's equity within one another. So, for example, let's say Tide, has a brand crisis. There wouldn't necessarily be that spillover into the other brands, or there wouldn't be that domino effect across the full portfolio because consumers don't necessarily make that connection.
Yeah, I think kind of tying it back into, what motivates healthcare organizations to change. And you mentioned the competitive environment and also the idea of mergers and acquisitions going on, which is, something I think everybody's experienced in their market. And I think laying it out this way, you really start to see as those competitors are maybe going through different iterations on this journey, as your own organization is going through this, it becomes pretty complicated to still remain distinct and make sure that that you've got that unique brand and representation in your market.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, I think another thing we often hear in healthcare are sort of the rogue brands. Nobody wants to be the brand police, but you really need to be intentional about this architecture, which I think is what you're getting at. But then you've got somebody over here or over there that wants to, rather than being part of that branded house, wants to have their own house somewhere and create something else. How do you, as an organization, handle that, deal with that? When is that more or less appropriate?
Yeah, and those use cases are inevitable, right? It's hard to have such rigid structure around these organizations, but that's this is where a hybrid approach can come into play, right? So to your question, there may be instances where you have multiple types of businesses or brands where you want to have the master brand prevalent, but not always in the same manner 100% of the time or 100% of the different use cases. So it just might not make sense. So this is where the hybrid architecture can become a mixture of the different organizing strategies. And you know, the organizing strategy of the frameworks aren't meant to force something once something gets decided, right? There is that fluidity and flexibility, but it starts to use it as a springboard into a plan or a roadmap and how to organize these brands. But again, there might be instances where you don't want to force, you know, a round peg into a square opening. So for example, Amazon here on the screen, Amazon leverages most of the brand architecture types, from sub brands to endorser brands, while also leveraging, you know, the corporate brand equity in their first party products. So the advantage of this approach is the ability to employ the individual brand strategies and sub brand hierarchies that make the most sense for the service at that point in time. You know, it's important to be able to map out this brand organizing strategy, especially during or ideally before a merger or acquisition. Sometimes it might even be part of the terms is to have these things figured out. But whatever the strategic end state looks like, it's important to take into consideration, you know, the consumer affinity towards the acquired brand to better understand what the roadmap and what the evolution over time needs to look like. An example of that is FedEx, and I love using this example because it's so clean on the surface. I'm sure it was tremendously challenging internally, but on the surface, it's so clean, and it doesn't happen over a couple of years. I mean, this is an evolution of years. So when we think about the FedEx acquisition of Kinko's, now they knew going into that acquisition that they wanted to fold the Kinko's brand or the Kinko's name into the FedEx identity and brand. So, but they also knew that the consumer affinity towards that was too high. So if they were to, you know, day one, Kinko's is acquired, and day two, the Kinko's name is gone, it's too disruptive and too detrimental to the business aspect from an economics perspective. So rather than, you know, flipping the switch, it's how do we map this out over time so that we can get to a point where we can pull out the Kinko's name and then we can get to our desired end state. So as you see, the phase one is simply about making the connection. So pulling the two names together in the FedEx or the master brand identity to make that connection. And then as we move over time, the consumer affinity and the brand equity starts to shift from Kinko's into the FedEx brand, the name and that recognition. So once that starts to occur, you can start to pull away that Kinko's name, and then you can get to that desired end state.
It's such a challenge. I'm probably still living somewhere back in phase one as far as my perception of the brand. And I think that's a great example of how long over time, you know, when you've got that kind of, you know, being top of mind in a space, in a community, it's not an overnight kind of, and having that plan out there is really important. The question that we get a lot, you know, working so much in the web space is, what does this mean for your website, your digital properties, and what does the brand architecture tell you? You know, I feel like it's really a touchstone for those digital, for the digital ecosystem. But what should it be telling you about things like domain strategy and how to create that user experience?
Yeah, you know, one point to note is, you know, as organizations and systems grow through mergers and acquisition or acquiring multiple brands, which absolutely highlights the need for this plan, right? The more brands acquired, the more brands that need to be managed, and they are all and can be different, right? So think about the logistics, just the sheer volume and logistics and the potential inefficiencies it drives from a cost and resource perspective of having multiple brand identities to manage. It can absolutely become unmanageable if the resources aren't growing with that as well. So to your question, no matter how many products or services or services you offer, brands you have, think about how your target audience will recognize each of them or experience each of them. So what the brand architecture does is it helps you to define what that relationship is and helps your brand stay organized internally as well as externally. So this brand architecture roadmap evolution over time, it's a roadmap for your brand identity. It's a roadmap for brand development. It's it's a plan and it's an evolution for design and web development, along with the domain strategy, along with the digital ecosystem. So by having this roadmap, it increases the flexibility for product or service expansion in the future because it has that framework built. And I think one thing to note too is I don't believe any brand is too small to benefit from this kind of thinking or this kind of organization. It's important to have a plan for how you want to organize your brand or brands. The discussion earlier around the rogue brands, that can happen without any kind of acquisition or any kind of partnership. It could be maybe there's internal departments or teams that have separate identity. So being able to map that out from an architecture perspective, even if it is only internal facing, is super beneficial.
Yeah, definitely.
So the last reason, one of the most common reasons is, or why healthcare organizations rebrand is it's just simply outdated. So this is when the brand hasn't been touched in years or decades. It might be just time to modernize it a bit. And this is, I think, going to be the most common kind of rebrand. Businesses grow, they change. Consumers in the market grow, they change. It's important for brands to reflect their current marketplace. Remaining relevant keeps your competitive edge.
Yeah. But we've got a quick poll here to launch and just kind of asking folks that are listening today, what are some of the reasons, that you're thinking about what is top of mind for you, I guess, in terms of your brand, your organization, as far as where you stand today? What is the biggest challenge for you? Where do you see maybe the gaps in what your brand is doing for you today, or how that's represented? Give people a few minutes or a few seconds here just to quickly respond and see. We're getting a lot of brand is outdated.
Yep.
It looks like as it's coming in here. Cool. We'll just give it a couple seconds here, and we'll share those results. Yeah, so a lot of brand is outdated. Got some folks with the merger acquisition scenario reaching to new audiences. I think that's, we've talked about in some previous webinars, the new audiences as telemedicine has taken off in healthcare and reaching service areas. It really does change that landscape and your audience that you might be reaching. Lots of different directions that could go.
Yep. Yeah, and all of these are extremely opportunistic to the brand itself. And I think, for those that have selected brand as outdated, that is extremely opportunistic, especially to what we were talking about earlier around legacy. There's so much value, so much brand equity already established to be able to just modernize it a bit, to kind of, when you think about just polishing the rough edges or moving into modernization, just be relevant, it's so tremendously opportunistic.
Yeah, and I think that fits really well kind of with where we're headed. So if you've got that outdated brand, what can you do about it? Where do you start?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about what are the different types of rebranding, right? When we say rebrand, it can mean a number of different things. Everyone has their own interpretation, but I want to talk at a high level through two. One is the full rebrand. So this is going to be looking at the entirety of the iceberg. It can involve an entirely new approach, a new brand strategy. Maybe there's a change in leadership, direction, business objective, or a pivot in the market. But this is a complete transformation, starting from the bottom, moving it all the way up to the top. So, this moves from the bottom of the iceberg all the way up to rebranding the visual identity. So this is the full-on rebrand. This is in the entire transformation. The second piece is more where we're going now, and we'll be discussing, is the brand refresh or the visual rebrand. So This is oftentimes going to be the most referred to when we talk about the rebrand. It's going to be the most common because it's more frequent, or can be more frequent, and it can also be done gradually over time if the right bones are stood up. So a brand refresh is simply, think of this as a makeover of your organization, or of your brand, if you will. So think of it as a personal makeover. The DNA of who I am doesn't change, but maybe I want to, a sharper haircut, newer shoes, a more dated or updated outfit, but it doesn't change the essence or the thing that's below the water of what the brand stands for, but rather polishes the visible brand to how a person perceives it.
Yeah. I think what's great about this, really important, I think, throughout here to remember you've got these options. Not everything has to move all at once, and really being able to focus in on what you're trying to accomplish and what level in this giant iceberg is going to get you what you need. I think in a lot of cases, if you're feeling your brand is outdated, it's not so much the things underneath the water that we're feeling. It's
right.
not a huge change to our core values. It's not a huge shift in the way we're providing service. Probably maybe a little refresher on those things internally, but more adjustments in how do we express that externally.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So as an organization approaches that problem, how does all of that come together, particularly in terms of a digital experience? Like you said, a lot of times it's focused around the logo and some of the traditional types of media. What needs to come together in order to make this work in a digital environment?
Yeah. So now we've we have an understanding of what brand is at the very beginning. We have an understanding of why an organization might rebrand, the different types. So let's talk about, and to your question, let's move into the top of the iceberg, or the visible part, which is typically going to be the most the fun, the most creative, the visual identity, bringing that to life. So as we let off, to keep on your brand promise and to provide that consistent and seamless brand experience that to the consumer feels like one rather than many, it's important to have a comprehensive style guide. Just how we kick this off is, moving from a traditional first mindset to potentially even a digitally first mindset in terms of bringing about this visual identity. So it includes the depths of digital, and one that expands across the different devices. So from desktop to mobile, or whatever the device from a digital perspective might be. The point is, digital can no longer be the afterthought or not included at all in the style guide when establishing or updating the visual identity as part of the brand refresh.
So as we think about building out the digital style guide and understanding what its must-haves are, it must start with the brand strategy. So when we build out this style guide, include the brand strategy outline. What are the values? What are its purpose? What is the promise, the voice and tone, etc.? Really study your brand. By being able to start with the brand strategy, you can let the visual identity be rooted in what the brand stands for and needs to embody. So the goal here is to really use your brand values and translate them into a visual language. And then we move into the logo usage.
Right, understand the logo, define the logo uses and options, the flexibility of the logo word mark and graphic for various applications, the favicon, the app icons, social and online profiles. Will there be logo animation and movement? Establish rules for the different lockups and positioning. Long are the days where what's included is only a vertical and horizontal lockup. Understand all the different uses and use cases and have those defined so that it's easy and seamless, and those questions are already answered in terms of how to use those things. Are you hearing me okay, David?
Yep, sounds like you're back and coming through clearly here. So I think we're good to go.
Cool. So moving from logo usage to color, determine the color palette and its uses, right? So what's the primary, what's the secondary, what's going to be the tertiary, along with all the different UI component color options. On the surface, it feels pretty simple in terms of, hey, you might have one or two primaries and a secondary, but once you move into the user interface, what does that look like? Have that defined to drive the efficiencies. You know, when we think about color, aside from ensuring that the color aligns and translate the brand values accordingly and makes that connection, ensure it meets and passes accessibility color ratios. Especially with digital, it's vital the experience is inclusive to as many people as possible. You know, there'll be times where we'll be working with a client during, you know, a redesign, and, you know, we'll get their traditional style guide, but sometimes we'll have to tweak it to work on digital just for the sheer fact that the colors, the brand colors aren't accessible. So keep that in mind in terms of building this out and establishing that color palette. The other piece is typography, right? So define typography. A large portion of web design is actually typography. So this is one of the most important communication tools between the actual website or the digital experience and the visitors. So set and determine the hierarchy, the body copy, the bold and italic versions. What's the font family? What's the weight, the color, etc. Think about the custom copy. Define what the primary and secondary typefaces are, and depending on what those are, especially in the digital environment, determine if there needs to be fallback fonts, just so there's a safety mechanism for that. The other one is iconography. From a design and aesthetic perspective, these can come in many different shapes and sizes and convey different tones. So it's important to have these included to ensure the tone that they are conveying, much like the rest of the pieces here, are the style that match the brand and essence of the design. Determine if you'll be wanting custom icons, which if you go that route, be invested in establishing and setting aside the time to build those out. Or maybe you want to go with more of a ready-made icon library, such as Font Awesome or leverage the material design icons. And then we move into photography and illustrations. Photography clearly speaks 1,000 words and is such a critical component to the web design. They evoke so much emotion and connectivity. So provide style and direction for choosing and using photography. Ensure it connects to the brand values and mission and tone. You know, and then from an illustration standpoint, define a plan for that. Does the brand even want to lean into illustrations? If so, what is the art direction? Have guardrails and rules in place for that. Also, when we think about photography and illustrations, are there opportunities where you can start to leverage the offline retail experience and the design aesthetics of that offline experience into the digital experience? We last year worked with a client, and we did just that, right? So we worked with and launched a redesigned children's website. And one of the strategic design decisions was being able to take the art and building aesthetics of the offline experience and merge it into the digital experience as a core design component. And that seamlessly bridged the gap in terms of being able to provide that seamless, that continuity experience, where we were able to take those pieces of art, draw those on paper, and then translate them into custom illustrations.
Yeah, I think this is such a really great example. You know, projects like this are a lot of fun, you know, and particularly in this one, there's a lot of more whimsical kinds of things to work with and create a really nice visual presentation. But I do think it's a great reminder that a lot of healthcare is really tied to place. It's tied to a physical location, a community. It's experienced locally. And, you know, even if you don't have beautiful sculptures throughout your building, there are other ways to really communicate that visually.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. 100%. You know, it's no longer experience A and experience B. It's one experience, and the more we can tie those and converge those, you know, the more consistent that experience is going to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of brands and a lot of sites that I've seen run the risk of feeling just so generic. You know,
Yeah.
Does this organization actually serve my community? You know, is this my local healthcare facility or not, it's sometimes really hard to tell because it's so, when you have too much stock photography or too much
Mhm.
standardization, it just removes some of that.
Yep, exactly. Being able to have your own custom artwork or custom photography, it immediately makes that deeper connection versus what might feel like stock. So it's also important to think about animation and movement. First even asking yourselves, should we even lean into this? And if so, how does that exist, and to what capacity? There's such a wide variety, there's such a spectrum for how deep you can lean into animation and movement. The biggest component here will be building out the user interface styles and the various interactions. So this is going to be across the various devices and screen sizes. So think about grid layouts, forms, buttons, spacing, interaction elements, content types, avatars, along with the visual style. This is where further efficiency can be had by providing the CSS. So no longer does everything need to be recreated from a very static style guide, but including the CSS along with it just drives efficiency and ensures the consistency of that style. And then the last two, I think including do's and don'ts. It's always easier to better understand the do's when they're next to the don'ts. Primarily, you see these with logo lockups and usage. But whenever there's a point of complexity or room for interpretation, show it next to a don't to better emphasize what the do is. And then, of course, end with, what's the governance and what's the process around all this, especially within larger systems or non-centralized teams using this. Outline the process for designing, building, and delivering before launching this. You want to ensure all of your hard work into building this is actually going to be executed how it was intended to be used.
So this is kind of the, pretty cut and dried. You've written it all down. You've created this enormous document. Living document, I assume. It's, not something that doesn't change. You pack away and doesn't get touched again for years. But once you've kind of put all of this thought into it and collected all of this, where does an organization go from there?
Yeah, solid question, right? Is we need to consider where to put it, how to share it, where to host it. So there's a couple of ways. One is, the digital style guide can be saved as a PDF or whatever the mechanism is, and it can be appended ideally to the larger comprehensive brand style guide. This will be the simplest and the easiest way to go about that. But what's important is thinking about who owns this internally, who's going to be responsible for ensuring that the integrity of what's in this document is actually being followed and executed against. Now, there's variations in a spectrum of what the brand police are, but to have ownership around making those decisions, or to have a process in place for funneling those assets through to ensure that integrity lasts and carries through. The other option is a bit more sophisticated, a ton of time, and it's time extensive, but it's more ideal for the larger teams, is to have or build a living, breathing destination to host a design system. So a design system is like the style guide's big brother, right? So where you'd have everything completely detailed out. This can be quite the undertaking, but extremely helpful in situations for larger and dispersed teams of designers and developers. So regardless of the path, the end goal is to take all this work and to arrive at a single source of truth for designing and building out the brand experiences across the offline and digital. It's bridging the gap. It provides one seamless, one consistent brand experience.
Yeah, I think that's, it may seem a little vague to some people, but it's really that connection, I think, that you're getting at between a set of things that make a great user experience generically for any website, and those things that are specific to your brand, and combining that into what's going to make specifically a great user experience that supports your brand, and how are those, kind of broken up into pieces that can be easily used and accessed and repurposed over time. I think there's some real sophistication there in how you're thinking about that, and as an organization, to take that approach requires something that's a little bit different. As you walk through all these pieces that go into thinking about brand, thinking about a strategy, lots of different types of partners that organizations work with throughout that, whether that's on the design, on just the visual design or logo design, or the communication strategy behind these things. And I think that this is a unique skill set to look for as well, of connecting the dots between UX and that brand strategy in a way that creates something of value that has lasting value to it.
Yeah, you're right, and I do think there is a gap that we often see with clients where other typical web vendors just probably aren't able to lean into. So for example, there's a brand refresh, one has occurred, but the outcome of that in terms of the style guide doesn't include the depths for executing it across the digital patient journey. So what we can do, and what we're really good at, is we can help kind of bridge that gap, and we can help translate that foundational brand refresh into their digital ecosystem. Typically, there is that gap where you have this traditional style guide, but then you need it executed, but there's no translation to how to execute it. So once that's developed, the developers, the design, they can run with it. So we can do that in a couple of different ways, and we have done this a couple of different ways. Is we can take that foundational brand refresh from either the in-house creative team or branding agency and build out the digital style guide from it. So that all the things we just walk through, we can help develop that. Or we can actually be pulled into the rebrand process. We can be pulled upstream and work with or alongside either that in-house team or that branding agency to help build out the digital style guide to ensure that we are thinking holistically about that experience. One example comes to mind is we worked with a client where the master collegiate brand had gone through a brand refresh. But the execution of that brand refresh was left up to the individual entities. So the athletics department, the healthcare space, et cetera, et cetera. The client reached out, needed to be able to take that master brand refresh style guide, which was just, master brand and very foundational. We were able to then extend it into all their healthcare digital ecosystem. So they had multiple properties. So not only were we able to develop a digital style guide, which provided that language needed for the digital ecosystem, but we were also able to provide a UI or a user interface component library so that when developers need to build out a site, a page, or add a content component, they can easily tap into this UI component where it already is designed. It already has the CSS built out so that they can really provide efficiency at scale across many different domains that they're managing. So, being able to bridge that gap not only provides the necessary brand consistency, but it provides tremendous internal efficiency for building out these sites.
Yeah, it's really that playbook of, as you go through, you've got multiple people across the organization working on this digital ecosystem, launching new initiatives, things that maybe weren't even thought of when those initial brand guidelines were put together. How do you create that central repository? It's so valuable to be able to just run quickly, to really speed up what the organization can do while staying on brand.
Yeah, 100%. And another example is we're actually working with a client right now where they had gone through a brand refresh, and it was, again, at the traditional offline perspective, all while their web presence or their website still looked dated. So in order to bridge that gap, what we did is we stepped in and we built out a digital style guide, And it wasn't just for the website, but it was, hey, here's how it needs to translate for social. Here's how it needs to translate within your digital advertising. So we built all those components and style guides out so that now they have this thing that they stuck, a ton of money into on the onset around this brand refresh. Now it's extendable. Now it extends into the full patient journey, and it provides that consistency and relevancy.
Yeah, I think doing that foundational work, that's a good point as well. Making those, once you've done that foundational work, making the incremental changes becomes much easier. If
Exactly.
this color or that color needs adjustment, or typography has changed, it's very centralized.
100%. And that's a key reminder and something to highlight is, when we think about it was easier to not touch those when we're thinking about purely offline, because it's harder to change, right? But at the speed of which the digital ecosystem is evolving, the different touch points, the different devices, it's important that, yes, we have this framework of a style guide, a digital style guide, but it also has to be set up that it can be flexible and nimble and scalable and extendable depending on the shifting environment. So that it's absolutely a key point. Cool. So I wanted to just talk about, quickly about, some key considerations your web design agency would need, or would need to be aware of during a rebrand. So the first thing is, the unseen part of the iceberg. If this is available, it's important for the design partner to study the brand. And we touch on that a little bit with the digital style guide in of itself, but what's the brand strategy? What makes up the brand? The next thing is understanding of the brand architecture, vision, whether it's short-term or long-term. Again, if this is available, what is the plan for how to treat each of these brands or master brands, and how are those to be used? If timing is right, don't let digital design be an afterthought. Pull the partner up into the process, or at least as part of the process, have that established handoff to further extend it into the digital guide. Style guide governance plan. Provide the agency visibility in terms of who will be using it. How will it be used? Is it an in-house or a small in-house team, a large dispersed team, agency partners, et cetera? This will help provide guidance on how deep to go in terms of building out a digital style guide, how deep detail or how much detail you'll want to need in terms of to establish that governance plan and process. In most cases, the more dispersed or the larger the team, the more hands touching it, probably the more guardrails in place. And then lastly, what's the timeline? What is associated or what's hinging on the rebrand? Is there a soft launch internally that might require separate deliverables or approaches? Is there a marketing campaign driving a launch? What's the plan for all the other assets that need to be changed aside from the digital or aside from just the web, whether it's print, mobile, social, et cetera? So it's important to have your web vendor, your web partner, having the awareness into these at least at a high level, just to understand all of the moving parts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should mention as well, there's certainly a lot of aspects. We've really focused on a lot of the visual design and user experience design aspects today. A lot of areas, voice and tone for your content is one that comes to mind, where could be an entire separate, and I think we've probably already done a couple of webinars on that in the past. But another thing that really is something that needs to align with that brand, and is another aspect.
Right. Yeah, and especially when we're thinking about a rebrand that consists of a new name or a new entity, but thinking about from a digital perspective, SEO or business listings, domain strategy, how you're going to treat the microsites, the blogs, paid advertising, all of those pieces to the bigger brand puzzle really need to be considered, especially when there's a rename involved.
Absolutely. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour here, and so I want to kind of wrap up. And what are your kind of final thoughts there, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, to sum it up in a sentence or two, A style guide helps ensure a continuous brand experience. It means that no matter how, when, or where a customer experiences your brand, they are experiencing the same underlying traits. Having that consistency and continuity removes the friction. And it's the consistency across every touch point that really helps to build and establish the brand, and really helps to establish the brand loyalty and equity over time.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Eric. Really appreciate the conversation, and lots to think about in terms of brand and design, and what that might mean for all those folks that are frustrated with their outdated brand today. I wanted to remind everybody we've got a offer for a digital branding consultation. If you'd like to continue the conversation, and you probably have some very unique one-on-one kinds of questions about your organization and where you are in that brand journey, this is a great opportunity to bounce some questions around and get some experts from our team to just sit down and just no strings attached, shoot the breeze about what you have going on and what you're struggling with. I know just in talking with folks throughout the healthcare industry, there's always something that is going on, and you just need some outside opinion and get some thoughts going, or see if you are on the right track with where you're headed. So we love having those conversations, and definitely encourage you to take advantage of that. I want to be sure to mention as well next month's webinar. Eric, if you can skip forward to that. Next month, Tim Lane, our Director of Digital Marketing, and Joe Drescher, Digital Marketing Strategist, will be talking about how to do more with healthcare digital advertising. And just that, I think, will be a really great conversation about all the things that you could be doing with your paid strategy, and also how that intersects with organic search, and how to make sure that those two things are really playing well together. It's a struggle that a lot of organizations have. So be sure to check that out at diginetrec.com/webinars to sign up for that. And then we'll wrap up there. So appreciate your time and attention today, and we really look forward to seeing you next month.